He said he wanted someone younger. That's how 26 years of my life ended, over coffee and a half-hearted apology he practiced in the mirror. I sat across from him, stirring sugar into a drink I didn't even taste, pretending the world wasn't crumbling in front of me. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like the lines on my face and the gray strands in my hair were some sort of crime he was forgiving me for. But the thing that hurt the most wasn't that he wanted someone else. It was how easily he said it, as if our memories were just items he could leave behind on the table. Before we continue to the story, please subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next. The morning after he left, I walked into the kitchen and his mug was still there. The one with the chipped handle I kept meaning to throw away. It sat on the counter like it was waiting for him, but he wasn't coming back. He had packed his bags in silence, his eyes darting everywhere except toward me. I didn't cry that night. I just sat on the edge of our bed staring at the dent his body left in the mattress. The room smelled of his cologne and guilt. A week later, I saw the photos online. She was 28. Perfect skin. Bright smile. She worked at his office, of course. They looked happy in that sickening, rehearsed way people do when they think the world is theirs. He had posted the caption, "A new beginning." I laughed at the irony. He forgot that his new beginning was built on the ruins of mine. But revenge, I learned, isn't always about shouting or breaking things. Sometimes it's about waiting. Watching. Letting time turn pain into power. I wasn't going to ruin my dignity for him. No, I'd let him think he'd won. I deleted every photo of us, boxed up our life together, and began rebuilding quietly. Every morning I walked past the mirror and whispered, "Not yet, but soon." It started with something small. He had left me the house because he wanted to look noble, like the kind of man who took care of his ex-wife. But he didn't realize I owned half of his company's shares too, shares he forgot to transfer properly before our divorce. I let my lawyer handle the silence. He didn't even notice the clause that gave me power over certain voting rights. I didn't need to confront him yet. The game was just beginning. He called me 3 months later, his voice trembling beneath fake politeness. "Hey, I just noticed a little hiccup with the company documents. Could we, talk about it?" I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "Of course," I said softly, "I'm always happy to talk." That call ended with him realizing that his hiccup gave me the leverage to approve or deny a new business expansion. He stuttered something about friendship, about understanding. I told him to email me. He must have thought I was bitter. He didn't know that bitterness fades, but strategy lasts forever. I watched as his company's public image began to shift. His girlfriend started attending meetings, sitting beside him like she belonged there. She had opinions now, and investors didn't like her. They called her a distraction. I just listened during board meetings, saying nothing, letting her dig the hole deeper. The moment came unexpectedly. One evening, I was invited to a corporate gala I used to organize when I was his wife. This time, I went as a shareholder. I wore a black dress, not glamorous, but commanding. When I walked in, heads turned. I could feel his discomfort across the room. His new woman whispered something in his ear, probably asking who invited me. He smiled too tightly, like his face might crack. I stayed calm. I laughed with investors, talked numbers, avoided his gaze. Then, when the moment felt right, I excused myself to the stage. It wasn't planned. It was instinct. The host was calling for a toast to celebrate the company's success. I asked for the mic and smiled at the audience. "Before we raise our glasses," I began, "I just want to thank everyone here for believing in this company, especially those who helped build it from the ground up." My voice didn't shake. It was steady. Sharp. Controlled. He watched me from the corner, frozen. I didn't look at him once. I talked about loyalty, partnership, and integrity. And then I said it, the line that made everyone fall silent. Some people think starting over means walking away. But real strength, I said, letting the pause hang in the air, is facing what you've broken and realizing the cracks are what made it beautiful in the first place." The applause was quiet at first, then loud enough to drown the panic on his face. That night, as I left the gala, he followed me out to the parking lot. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Trying to humiliate me?" I turned, meeting his eyes for the first time in months. "No," I said softly. "I'm just reminding everyone who I am." He stood there, shaking. I could tell the realization was setting in, that the woman he left behind was no longer the woman who waited for him. I didn't need to destroy him. He was already doing that himself. But what came next, that was when the real revenge began. He didn't call for weeks after that night, but I knew he was restless. I could sense it in the silence, in the way his assistant's email started to sound more desperate, more careful. Rumors were spreading about his girlfriend's attitude at the office, about how she was making decisions without consulting anyone. I didn't need to start those rumors. I just needed to let the truth travel. And the truth always finds its way. When he finally showed up at my house, it was raining. The man standing at my door didn't look like the confident husband who once left me for someone younger. He looked tired, older, defeated. His eyes carried the same arrogance, but it was wrapped in panic now. "We need to talk," he said, brushing the water off his coat. I stepped aside. "Then talk," I replied. He sat on the couch, staring at the floor like a scolded child. She's ruining everything," he muttered. "The board doesn't trust her, the investors are pulling out, and now they're saying you have controlling rights you shouldn't have." He looked up at me, expecting pity. I gave him silence instead. "You could fix this," he pleaded. "You could talk to them. I know you don't want to see me fail." That was the moment I realized he still didn't understand me. He thought the years I spent loving him made me weak. He thought that because I had cried once, I couldn't rise now. I stood, walked over to the window, and said quietly, "You wanted a younger woman. Someone who made you feel alive again. I hope she's helping you fix things." His jaw tightened. "Don't do this," he said, standing up. "You're better than this." I turned around, met his eyes, and smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I'm finally exactly what you made me." The next week, the board called an emergency meeting. He sat across from me at the long mahogany table, his new fiancée pretending to belong in a room full of people she didn't understand. The chairman cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the recent decline in performance," he said carefully. "We believe new leadership is necessary." She squeezed his hand, whispering something to him, but I knew the decision had already been made. I had spent the last 3 months aligning myself with the quiet voices in the room, the ones who watched but never spoke. Power doesn't need to shout. When the vote was called, my name came up as interim CEO. He looked at me, shocked. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The applause from the boardroom was enough. She stood abruptly and walked out, muttering something about betrayal. He stayed seated, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. That night, I sat in my office, the one that used to be his. His nameplate was still on the desk. I didn't remove it. Not yet. I wanted him to see it there when he came in to collect his things. A few days later, the company began to recover. Investors returned. Press releases praised the return of steady leadership. But my revenge wasn't about money. It wasn't even about power. It was about dignity. About reclaiming every piece of myself he'd taken for granted. I went to a small cafe one afternoon, the same one where he'd told me about her. The same seat, the same corner, the same cup of coffee I never finished that day. But this time, I smiled as I sipped it. The waitress recognized me from the papers. "You're the new CEO, right?" she asked with a grin. I nodded. "Yes," I said softly. "Something like that." But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. That evening, I got a call from the hospital. It was him. He'd been in a minor car accident. Nothing fatal, just a few bruises and a bruised ego. Still, hearing his voice, weak and uncertain, stirred something I didn't expect. Not pity, not love, just memory. I went to see him. He was lying there, looking smaller than I remembered. "You came," he whispered. "Of course," I said. "I always do, don't I?" He chuckled bitterly. "You won, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I just sat beside him, looking at the man who once made me feel invisible. "I didn't want to win," I finally said. "I just wanted to stop losing." He looked away, his voice trembling. "She's gone," he said. "She left when the money stopped." I should have felt satisfaction, but all I felt was a quiet sadness. This wasn't the victory I imagined. Revenge doesn't heal, it simply evens the scales. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. "You were always stronger than me," he murmured. I just didn't want to admit it. I walked out of that room knowing he was right. A week later, he sent a letter. Not an apology, just acknowledgement. He signed over the rest of his shares, writing, "You'll do better with them than I ever did." I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and closed it. Sometimes closure doesn't come in fireworks or shouting. Sometimes it's a whisper in the rain. But as I soon learned, the past has a way of knocking one last time before it fades for good. The following month, things seemed to fall into place. The company flourished under my leadership. Employees who once walked on eggshells around him now smiled when they passed my office. I'd finally built something of my own, something no one could take away. But the peace I felt was strange. It wasn't satisfaction, not quite. It was a stillness that came after a storm, a quiet I wasn't sure I trusted. Revenge had filled a void, but what remained afterward was a kind of emptiness I hadn't anticipated. Then one morning, an envelope arrived at my office. No return address, just my name written in his familiar handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note and a photograph. The note said, "You were right. I was a fool to let you go. But I need your help now, for the last time." The photograph was of him standing outside a small, run-down building in another city. Something about his expression unsettled me. He looked lost. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself he'd made his bed, and I owed him nothing. But late that night, I found myself driving out of the city anyway. Old habits die hard. The address led me to a modest care home near the coast. When I walked inside, the nurse greeted me kindly. "He's been expecting you," she said. That surprised me. Expecting me? He hadn't even known if I'd come. I followed her down a quiet hallway, the sound of rain against the windows echoing softly. He was sitting by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. He turned when he heard me, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "You came," he whispered. His voice was weaker now, rougher. "I didn't think you'd actually show up." "I almost didn't," I said. "You didn't give me much of a reason to." He nodded slowly. "I know. I don't deserve your kindness." He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit. Please." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years pressing between us. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sick," he said quietly. "The doctors don't give me much time. And she's not coming back. None of them are." He laughed bitterly. "I built an empire and lost everything that actually mattered." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "You always thought love was something you could replace. But it's not a position you can fill. It's something you build. And once it's gone, it's gone." He looked at me with tired eyes. "I see that now. But I want to make things right before I go." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another envelope, placing it on the table between us. "It's my final will," he said. "Everything I still have goes to you. The house, the accounts, everything. Consider it what I should have given you years ago." I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "I don't want your money," I said softly. You don't get to buy forgiveness. It's not forgiveness, he murmured. It's acknowledgement. We sat there, both knowing there was nothing left to say. When I stood to leave, he caught my hand weakly. You were my greatest mistake, he said, his voice breaking. And the only thing I ever truly loved. I didn't answer. I just squeezed his hand once and walked away. He died 2 weeks later. I didn't attend the funeral. Instead, I went to the ocean that day, stood by the water, and let the wind carry away every trace of anger I'd ever held. Sometimes revenge ends not with victory, but with release. But as I looked out at the gray waves, I thought about something he'd said, about making things right. That phrase lingered in my mind like an echo. Because in his final days, he had done something else I didn't expect. A few days later, his lawyer called me in. Apparently, he hadn't only left me his remaining assets. He transferred ownership of a small scholarship fund I didn't even know existed. It was in my name now, dedicated to helping women restart their lives after divorce or loss. He'd called it the second beginning. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Maybe, in his final act, he'd finally understood what I was trying to teach him all along, that revenge isn't destruction. It's reclaiming your story. I used that fund to expand programs, to build support for women who'd been left behind, underestimated, or dismissed. And every time someone wrote to thank me, every time a woman stood tall again because of it, I felt a quiet victory echo through the years. Months later, I walked into the same boardroom that once witnessed my humiliation and my triumph. The team applauded as we closed our most successful quarter to date. I stood there, composed, calm, the ghost of my old life completely gone. In the corner of my office, I kept one thing, a small framed photo of the two of us from decades ago. Not as a reminder of love, but of strength. Of how far I'd come from the woman who once waited for a man's validation. Now I validated myself. And as I watched the sunset through the tall glass windows, I finally understood the irony of it all. The man who left me for youth gave me something he never could have predicted, timeless power. I whispered quietly to the empty room, you wanted someone younger. But I became someone stronger. The room felt lighter after that. Before long, I knew this chapter of my life was closing, and a new one was beginning. Not of revenge anymore, but of peace earned through pain, dignity built from betrayal, and wisdom paid for in heartbreak. And though no one else would ever know the full story behind my calm smile, I carried the truth like a crown, silent, shining, and unbreakable. A year passed before I visited his grave. The sky was pale gray that morning, the kind of weather he used to love, quiet, reflective, without fuss. The marble headstone was simple, engraved only with his name and 2 dates. I brought white lilies, the same flowers he'd once given me on our anniversary, long before the lies and betrayal. I placed them gently on the grave and stood there in silence, the sound of the wind threading softly through the trees. I forgave you, I whispered. Not because you asked for it, but because I needed to. My voice didn't shake. You broke me once, but you also taught me how to rebuild. And I did. Better than you ever imagined. Walking back to the car, I realized how different I'd become. I wasn't the woman who cried behind locked doors anymore. I wasn't the woman who measured her worth by someone else's approval. I was something sharper now, quieter, but infinitely stronger. There's a kind of beauty in that transformation, the kind forged in silence, rebuilt from ashes. That night, I returned home and sat by the fire with a cup of tea. The city outside my window pulsed with light, but I felt calm, grounded. I opened an old box of letters, some his, some mine, and began to burn them one by one. Each flame felt like a release. By the time I reached the last letter, I hesitated. It was one he'd written years before our marriage fell apart. His handwriting was younger, firmer. It read, no matter what happens, promise me we'll never forget who we were before the world hardened us. I stared at the words for a long time before setting the paper on fire. The flame curled around the ink until it vanished. But I didn't forget who I was before. I remembered, and then I evolved. Weeks later, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership event. They wanted me to share my journey, the rebuilding, the business, the quiet triumphs. I stood on stage beneath the soft lights, the audience full of faces eager to listen. For a moment, I felt nervous. Then I thought about every moment of humiliation, every cruel word that had once made me small, and the fear vanished. When I was younger, I believed strength came from never breaking. But life taught me something different. True strength comes from breaking, and then choosing to rebuild differently each time. We are not defined by who hurt us, but by who we become after. There was silence in the room when I finished, followed by slow, sincere applause. In that moment, I felt something shift, not just for me, but for the people listening. Because they saw themselves in my story. They understood that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about showing the world you survived the fire and built your own light from the embers. Later that night, I received a message from one of the event organizers. She said an anonymous donor had contributed a large sum to expand the Second Beginning Foundation. She didn't know who it was, but I had a feeling. Maybe it was one of his associates honoring his final wishes. Or maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that his final act of acknowledgement continued to grow into something that helped others. Years went by, and the world changed in quiet ways. My hair turned silver, my steps slowed, but my mind stayed sharp. I often thought about how differently life could have turned out if I had chosen bitterness over strength, silence over action. But then I would remind myself, bitterness destroys the person holding it, while strength rebuilds them. Sometimes, at night, I still heard echoes of his voice, but it no longer hurt. It was just part of the story, a chapter closed with dignity. One afternoon, I visited a new shelter we'd opened under the foundation. A young woman approached me, holding her baby, tears in her eyes. "You don't know me," she said, "but your story saved my life." I smiled softly. "Then it was all worth it," I said. When I left the shelter that day, I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the sky. The sun had begun to set, golden light spilling across the buildings. I closed my eyes and let the warmth touch my face. That's when I realized something important. Revenge was never about hurting him. It was about reclaiming myself. The pain he gave me had become the foundation of my power. I turned betrayal into purpose, heartbreak into legacy. And that was the ultimate victory. As I walked away, I felt a deep, quiet gratitude, not for what I'd lost, but for who I'd become because of it. And if I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. Because sometimes, the cruelest thing you can do to those who tried to break you is to live beautifully anyway. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful tales of strength, betrayal, and redemption.